The interview that changed everything. The lights in the studio were warm, golden, and unforgiving. Cameras swiveled quietly on robotic arms, their lenses like 1,000 unblinking eyes waiting to witness something unexpected. In the velvet silence just before going live, Sandra Bullock sat perfectly poised on the couch, her fingers lightly interlaced in her lap, the shimmer of her silver bracelet catching the overhead lights as if foreshadowing something precious about to unfold. It had been years since she last saw Keanu in person. Not on a set, not in an awards hall, but in private. And tonight, he would walk onto that stage, sit beside her, and the world would watch. She wasn't nervous for the cameras, not for the questions, not even for the millions watching, but she was nervous for him. Because somewhere between rehearsed laughs and well-timed applause, she had decided, or perhaps simply realized, that she had carried something unspoken in her chest for decades, and tonight she would let it out. Across the studio, Keanu Reeves stood with his hands in his pockets, head slightly down, listening to the producer give final instructions. He was calm as always, understated, mysterious, with a kind of weight in his silence that made people lean closer when he spoke. His black suit looked nearly untouched by time, much like him, but his eyes had softened over the years. Loss, reflection, and quiet acceptance had etched a different kind of wisdom into him. He wasn't here to promote a film. Not really. He was here because Sandra had asked. Personally. And that meant something. That always meant something. The host welcomed them with the usual charm, guiding the audience through laughter and nostalgia, playing old clips from their early days together, their first film, their infamous flirtatious interviews, the timeless moment that hinted at what could have been. And for a while, they laughed like old friends. The audience was eating it up, but underneath the laughter there was a current. Something real, something trembling. Then came the moment. So, the host began, his grin widening with rehearsed mischief. We all know the chemistry between you two is legendary. But, Sandra, you once said you had a little crush on Keanu during filming. Is that still true, or have we all been holding on to an ancient myth? The room froze. Just a second. Barely a beat. But everything changed in it. Sandra didn't laugh. She didn't deflect. She turned her head slowly toward Keanu, her lips parted like she'd been holding her breath since the 90s. And then, she spoke, not with the practiced poise of a seasoned actress, not with the safety of a pre-approved script, but with raw, trembling truth. It wasn't a crush, she said softly, eyes locked onto his, her voice cracking ever so slightly. It was love, quiet, unspoken, but real. And it's been sitting with me for years. Maybe because I was too scared to ruin what we had, or maybe because timing was never our friend. But I loved you, Keanu. I still do. The crowd gasped, not out of scandal, but because they felt something shatter. The wall of what-ifs that had stood between these two icons for decades. The host looked stunned. Producers scrambled behind the glass. But on the couch, in the center of that golden light, there were only two people who mattered now. Keanu didn't speak immediately. He looked at her, truly looked, as if he were seeing her again for the first time. Then, with the gentlest movement, he reached out and took her hand. His voice, when it came, was quieter than anyone expected. I waited for you to say that, he said, not looking at the audience, not at the camera, but only at her. For 20 years. I thought I had imagined it. But I carried it anyway. Every day. Silence blanketed the studio, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was reverent, emotional. The kind of silence that wrapped around you like a sacred truth you weren't ready for, but needed all the same. After the show, the internet exploded. Memes, hashtags, video clips, theories. Was it staged? Was it real? Were they finally going to be together? But for Sandra, none of that mattered. Because that night, when the cameras stopped and the makeup faded and the audience disappeared, Keanu walked her to her car, just like he used to do on set. He opened the door, he waited, and before she stepped in, she turned to him and whispered, "Do you think we missed our chance?" He smiled, that old familiar smile that carried both sorrow and hope. And he said, I think. We were just waiting for the right kind of silence. And just like that, it began again. Or perhaps it began for the very first time. We were never just co-stars. That night didn't end with a kiss, a grand romantic gesture, or fireworks for the press to feed on. It ended with a quiet pause, a door gently closing, and two souls, long entangled by fate and fear, finally walking toward the truth they had always denied themselves. Sandra sat in her car for 10 minutes without turning the engine on, her hands gripping the steering wheel while her chest wrestled with waves of disbelief and release. Her confession hadn't been planned, not in that moment, not in those words, but something had cracked open when she looked at Keanu on that couch. Not the movie star version of him, not the mystery man the world adored, but him, the man who once waited with her in silence during rain delays on set, who bought her a book instead of jewelry when she won her first major award, who never made promises but always kept showing up when no one else did. That night on live television, she hadn't spoken to the audience. She had spoken to him, and he had answered. After all those years, Keanu, on the other hand, didn't need to sit in silence. He walked, not to his car, not to his hotel, but aimlessly under the Los Angeles sky, hands in his pockets, thoughts unspooling like a reel of film long overdue for editing. His mind wandered back to the first time he met her, on the audition floor, when her nervous energy clashed beautifully with his steady calm. He remembered how she laughed too loudly the first time, and how he smiled, not because her joke was funny, but because it was her. Back then, everything was simpler on the surface. Co-stars, rising stars, navigating Hollywood's endless noise. But underneath, something had already begun. Not an affair, not even a romance, but something purer, a recognition, like they had known each other in a life before cameras, before scripts, before fame. And in every life since, they had been trying to find their way back to one another. Over the years, their careers danced around each other like planets in orbit, always nearby, always gravitational but never colliding. They dated other people, won awards, survived tragedies, lost parents, grew wiser, and yet whenever her name appeared on his phone or his film trailer sat beside hers at a premiere, a small part of them would blink awake, like a flame sheltered in the wind. The industry called it chemistry. Fans called it unresolved tension. But for them, it was something quieter, a memory without time, a bond they couldn't explain without risking everything. The morning after the interview, headlines flooded every major outlet. Hollywood's most subtle love story finally comes to light. Sandra and Keanu, why didn't they ever get together? Decades of denial or perfect timing? Reporters scrambled for statements. Studios pitched reunion films. Tabloids stalked Sandra's driveway. But she didn't care. She canceled her meetings, turned off her phone, and made one decision that would change the rhythm of everything that followed. She sent Keanu a letter, not a text. Not a call, a handwritten letter. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet like him. She wrote about how she used to circle the day they wrapped filming every year in her journal, not because of the project, but because it meant she wouldn't see him again for a while. She admitted she would sometimes walk past the cafe they once sat in during a shoot in Prague, even though it had been closed for years. She told him that the hardest part of winning awards was not having anyone who truly knew her clapping in the front row. And then, near the end, she simply asked, "If we were just co-stars, why does it still feel like you're the only one I haven't outgrown?" When Keanu received the letter, he didn't respond right away. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he knew exactly what it meant. Sandra didn't write that letter for nostalgia. She wrote it for closure, or for a beginning. And beginnings, when you're not 20 anymore, feel heavier. Not with doubt, but with weight. The weight of knowing how precious time is. The weight of loss of things unsaid, of moments missed. And the terrifying weight of getting exactly what you always wanted, only to realize now you had to do something about it. 3 days later, she opened her front door to find him standing there, not with flowers or a suit, but in a hoodie, holding a motorcycle helmet and a cup of black coffee, the kind she always ordered on set. He didn't speak right away. She didn't either. They just stood there, in the quiet language only they understood. Then he smiled, slow, warm, and a little unsure. "I never replied to your letter," he finally said. Sandra nodded, her heart pounding so loudly she wondered if the neighbors could hear it. "I didn't need you to," she whispered. Keanu looked down, then back at her with something shimmering in his eyes. Maybe gratitude, maybe grief, maybe both. "But I wanted to," he said. "I just didn't want to do it in words." He offered her the helmet. "Come with me." No destination. No plan, no red carpet. Just two people who had waited decades to take the next step, finally standing at the edge of what could be. As the engine roared to life and the sun began to dip behind the skyline, she wrapped her arms around his waist. Not tightly, just enough, the way people do when they've been apart for too long, and in that moment, as the wind carried them down the street, something shifted. Not just in them, but in the world, because sometimes the most beautiful love stories are not the loudest. They are the ones whispered across time, across silence, across late-night walks and letters unsent. And when they finally unfold, they don't ask for applause. They just ask to be real. We took the long way back to each other. The road wound up through the quiet California hills, the hum of the motorcycle blending with the stillness of the late afternoon. Sandra leaned her head against Keanu's back, her fingers loosely curled around the edge of his jacket, not holding him tightly, but gently, like a breath she didn't want to disturb. The sky was soft and gold and endless. No paparazzi here, no red carpets or shouting fans. Just wind, asphalt, and time. The only witnesses to something that had taken over 2 decades to arrive. Neither of them spoke during the ride, not because there was nothing to say, but because silence had always been their language. And after so many years of missed timing and rehearsed interviews, silence felt like truth. When Keanu finally slowed the bike near a cliffside overlook, she didn't ask where they were. She simply got off, pulled the helmet off her head, and let her hair fall across her shoulders like she had just stepped out of a memory instead of a machine. He didn't look at her immediately. He walked toward the edge of the cliff, hands in his pockets again, eyes scanning the horizon like he was looking for an answer in the fading light. Sandra followed, standing beside him but slightly behind, watching his profile, not the view. She had always admired that about him, the way he could disappear into silence without making anyone feel left behind. The world called it mystery. She called it peace. But today, she needed something more than peace. She needed clarity. "Why now, Keanu?" she asked, her voice lower than the wind but louder than the fear in her chest. "Why did we wait so long?" He closed his eyes, exhaled slowly. "Because," he said without looking at her, "we were always too good at protecting each other's boundaries. We never crossed the line, even when we wanted to. Maybe we thought that was respect. And now?" she asked. He finally turned to her. There was no smile on his lips, but there was something deeper in his gaze, something raw and beautiful and a little scared. "Now, I think. Maybe that line was the only thing stopping us from being seen." She didn't cry. Not yet. But something inside her softened, and in that stillness she stepped forward and reached for his hand. Not with urgency, but with that same kind of careful reverence people use when they finally touch something sacred they've feared losing. He held her hand the way he had that night on the talk show. Not possessively, not dramatically, but fully. Like this was exactly where it was always meant to be. They sat on a fallen tree trunk near the edge and watched the sun disappear. The temperature dropped, but neither moved. It was the kind of moment that couldn't be scheduled, the kind of scene no director could plan, where two people who had spent their lives performing finally allowed themselves to just be. For the first time, they spoke not as Sandra and Keanu, not as stars or symbols or tabloid magnets, but as two people whose lives had run parallel for too long. "I used to tell myself it was safer to love you from a distance," Sandra whispered, "because if we actually tried, and it didn't work, I didn't want to know what life would feel like without even the dream of you." Keanu nodded. "I know that fear. I lived in it too." She laughed softly, wiping the corner of her eye. "We're cowards," he smiled. Maybe, or maybe we just weren't ready. There was a pause. Then she asked the question that had haunted her for years. Did you ever think about telling me? Before now. He leaned back slightly, the dying sun casting a glow across his cheek. Every time we hugged goodbye, he said, I wanted to stay. Sandra closed her eyes. So why didn't you? He turned to her, and this time he didn't hesitate. Because I didn't want to be another man who wanted something from you. Those words hit her harder than any love confession could have. Because in all her years in the industry, in all her relationships, so many people had admired her, used her, loved her for what she represented. Not for who she was when the lights were off, but Keanu had always seen the woman behind the smile, the tired eyes behind the perfect dress, the wounded heart that still believed in goodness. He had never chased her. He had waited for her, waited through other lovers, waited through life, waited through silence. I didn't want to be a man who needed you, he continued. I wanted to be the man you could fall into when you were ready. She looked at him then, tears streaming freely now, not from pain, but from the release of years of quiet longing. And in that moment she realized something profoundly simple. She had never needed him either. She had simply always wanted him. And maybe that was why it had taken so long. Because real love, the kind that lasts, isn't about chasing. It's about staying, even when the years stretch long, even when the timing breaks your heart, even when the silence feels safer. They stayed out there until the stars took over the sky. They didn't kiss. They didn't make promises. But something had shifted. Not like a falling domino, but like the first slow crack in winter ice before the thaw. The love was no longer a secret. It was no longer waiting. It was becoming. As Keanu drove her home that night, neither said much. But when he parked in her driveway, and she leaned in to kiss his cheek, she paused and whispered in his ear, Don't let me run this time. He turned his face slightly, forehead resting against hers. I won't. And for once, there was nothing left to say. Because some love stories don't begin when the world expects them to. Some love stories begin when two people finally stop hiding, and in the quiet, in the truth, in the timing that once felt cruel, they find that maybe, just maybe, the long way around was the only way home. The quiet between us was never empty. The days that followed were unlike anything either of them had known. There were no official announcements, no Instagram posts, no smiling photos to confirm what the world had guessed. Keanu and Sandra did not owe anyone proof of what was unfolding between them. They had given the public so many versions of themselves, the characters, the co-stars, the bittersweet interviews drenched in what-ifs, but this was different. This was private, sacred, a love story with no press release. And yet, even in its quiet unfolding, it felt louder than anything they had ever performed. Because now, for the first time, they weren't acting. They were allowing themselves to be. With all the hesitations, all the tenderness, all the terrifying honesty that had waited patiently beneath the years. Sandra invited him over for dinner the following Friday. No chef, no makeup, no housekeeper prepping the space. Just her, barefoot in jeans, stirring pasta while a Sinatra vinyl played low in the background. Keanu showed up early, flowers in one hand, a bottle of red in the other, and that same almost shy smile he had worn for 30 years. It was, by all definitions, ordinary. But to them, it felt like the most intimate thing they had ever done. Because love at their age wasn't about grand gestures. It was about permission. The permission to be real, to show up with your flaws, to sit across from someone and not feel like you have to be anything but tired and still deeply lovable. They talked for hours that night. Not about work or fame or scripts, but about being. About the silence they had both carried for years. Sandra told him about the time she almost called him on the night her mother died. How she held the phone and wept, but couldn't find the courage to ask for comfort from someone who had always been so quietly constant, so respectfully distant. Keanu, in turn, confessed how he had watched every one of her interviews over the years, not as a fan, but as a man searching for signs that maybe, just maybe, she still saw him the way he saw her. At one point, while refilling their wine glasses, Sandra leaned against the counter and said with a half laugh, "Do you think people can really fall in love after all this time? Or are we just clinging to a beautiful memory that should have stayed untouched?" Keanu walked over slowly, setting the bottle down before standing in front of her. He didn't touch her right away. He just looked at her with the kind of patience that only comes from a man who has known deep grief, who has seen the world take away the people he loved and still managed to open his heart again. "I think," he said softly, "we're not falling in love after all this time. We're just finally allowing ourselves to admit we never stopped." That moment broke something open in her. She didn't cry in the dramatic way cameras loved. It was quieter than that. A breath that caught, a hand that reached up to his chest as if grounding herself in something real. She let him hold her, really hold her, and in that still kitchen, surrounded by the smell of garlic and old records, Sandra Bullock, the woman who had mastered the art of surviving in Hollywood, who had raised a family, won awards, endured heartbreak, and built empires, allowed herself to need someone, not as a rescue, but as a return. Later that night, after dishes were rinsed and the wine bottle was empty, they sat on her porch in worn-out chairs, listening to the crickets and the occasional far-off hum of the city. Sandra had pulled a blanket over her lap and Keanu had kicked his boots off, his socks mismatched in a way that made her laugh. There was no talk of what comes next, no promises or future planning, just the rhythm of their breathing and the occasional brush of their fingers. Two teenagers in the bodies of adults who had seen too much to take moments like this for granted. "I used to wonder," she said after a long silence, "what it would have felt like to have you at my side through the hard years." Keanu nodded, not asking which years. He already knew. The failed relationships, the loneliness after adoption, the headlines she never commented on but always felt, the nights when the kids were asleep and the house was too quiet and the weight of being strong had become too much. "You were always there," she added, "even when you weren't. I just never let myself reach for you." He didn't respond with words. Instead, he gently rested his head against hers, his thumb drawing slow circles on the back of her hand. "I never stopped waiting," he whispered finally. That night, for the first time, he stayed. Not in the dramatic, passion-fueled way Hollywood loved to show, but in the simple way real people do. Brushing his teeth beside hers, laughing about old pajamas, setting the alarm for the kids' early Saturday soccer game. And when they climbed into bed, there was no performance, no tension, just two people who had traveled through decades, fame, and fear, and had finally arrived at the same moment, the same truth. In the dim light of the room, Sandra turned to face him. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I," he said without hesitation, and then she smiled. Because something about hearing that, not a promise of perfection, not a script of happily ever after, but an honest confession of shared vulnerability, made her feel safer than any words could. Because real love, the kind worth waiting for, isn't built on grand declarations. It's built on truth, on choice, on showing up, even after all the years you told yourself it was too late. And in that quiet room, filled with the hum of life finally making sense, Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves didn't begin a new chapter. They finally returned to the page they had always belonged on. Together. Love doesn't ask for permission. It asks for courage. They had always been used to the noise, the rumors, the headlines, the questions that filled the air long before the truth had a chance to speak. But this time, it felt different. This time, the noise wasn't coming from the outside. It was inside them, in the quiet moments when the world wasn't watching. When the dishes were being washed, when the kids were arguing over homework, when the dogs barked at nothing in the yard, when there were no cameras or velvet couches, just the two of them, and the weight of what they had finally stepped into. Loving each other publicly had been easy. A single moment on television had melted decades of tension and speculation. But living it privately, day after day, that was where the real courage began. Sandra had always been a fortress, the kind of woman who smiled in press rooms while bleeding behind closed doors, who raised her children with quiet strength, who built a life from ashes and held it all together with trembling grace. And now, as Keanu sat at her kitchen table one morning, watching her fold lunch bags and pour juice while still in pajama pants and a faded college sweatshirt, he saw something more precious than elegance or glamour. He saw the woman behind the icon, and he loved her even more for it. But even love, when it finally arrives after years of waiting, doesn't erase fear. It magnifies it. Because now there's something real to lose. And Sandra knew that too well. It happened during a quiet Sunday afternoon. The kids were at a sleepover, the house was unusually silent, and she found herself in the living room staring at a photo album she hadn't opened in years. Pictures from film sets, press tours, award shows, snapshots of a life that had always looked full from the outside. But as she flipped through the pages, a strange sadness crept in. So many of these moments she had lived beside him. Keanu in the background, at premieres, beside her on carpets, smiling gently behind her as she shone in the spotlight. And yet they had never been together. Not truly, until now. She closed the album and sat back, pulling her knees to her chest. When Keanu walked in, holding 2 mugs of tea, he saw it immediately. That subtle shift in her shoulders, the tightness in her gaze. "What's wrong?" he asked, sitting beside her. She shook her head, looking away. "I don't know. I think I'm still waiting for it to fall apart." He didn't speak. He set the mugs down and simply placed his hand over hers. "I keep thinking maybe it's too late," she whispered. "Maybe we missed the best version of us." He leaned in, his voice quiet but firm. "Sandra, we didn't miss it. We earned it." She looked at him, her eyes full of that ache that only comes from loving deeply, the ache of joy laced with fear. But what if we're just tired? What if this is just comfort? Familiarity? What if the world was right all along, that we were only good as a fantasy? Keanu took a long breath, then did something that startled her. He stood up and walked across the room to her bookshelf. He pulled out a notebook, one she didn't recognize. He handed it to her, then sat down again, waiting. She opened it slowly. Inside were letters. To her. Dozens of them. Some typed. Some handwritten. Some half-finished. All dated across years. Letters never sent. The first was from 1997, written after they finished their first film together. "You smiled at me today like we had known each other forever. I almost told you, but your driver pulled up and you waved goodbye like we were just co-workers. I wish I knew how to tell you you're more than that." Another from 2006, written on a hotel napkin, carefully pressed between pages. "You won an award tonight. You looked radiant, but I noticed your hands were shaking backstage. I wanted to hold them. I wanted to tell you I saw you. Not the dress, not the performance. Just you. But I didn't." She flipped page after page, her fingers trembling. Decades of restraint. Decades of love buried beneath silence. "I wrote them instead of sending them," he said gently, "because I never wanted to cross the line. But I couldn't not write them. I had to speak the truth somewhere, even if only to myself." Sandra covered her mouth, tears sliding down her cheeks. Not because she was sad, but because somewhere deep inside, she realized she had never been unloved. She had just been unaware. "You carried me," she whispered, barely able to speak. "All those years. And I didn't even know." "You didn't have to," Keanu replied. "I wasn't waiting for a reward. I was waiting for you. For when you were ready, that night." She sat beside him in silence, her head resting on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of the man who had loved her without condition, without possession, without ever asking for anything in return. And it was in that stillness that she finally understood. Love, the real kind, isn't loud. It doesn't chase. It doesn't demand answers or timelines. It simply waits. It holds space. It becomes a home you didn't realize you had been walking toward your whole life. In the weeks that followed, they began living in quiet rebellion, choosing truth over performance, vulnerability over perfection. Sandra no longer rushed to wear makeup in the morning. Keanu no longer hid behind silence when he wanted to say something tender. They learned how to argue, how to apologize, how to love like grown-ups with wounded hearts who still believed in healing. There were no fireworks, no Instagram fairy tales. Just two people, walking each other gently into the rest of their lives. And for the first time, the quiet between them was not filled with questions. It was filled with peace, because they were no longer imagining what could have been. They were living what finally was. When love arrives late, it arrives with meaning. The world kept moving. New films were released, new stars lit up the red carpet, new rumors tried to reclaim their place in the tabloids. But for Keanu and Sandra, time had slowed. Not in the way people think of slowing down, not with retirement or retreat, but with awareness, with intention. Their love, born quietly in the spaces between maybe someday and what if, now lived in the present. It existed not for validation, but for the soft, human comfort of waking up beside someone who had seen every version of you and still chose to stay. It had been 3 months since the talk show moment that shifted everything. 3 months since the world finally saw what had always been true beneath the surface. And yet, what happened after mattered more than what had aired. Because what came after was life. Keanu helping her fold laundry on Sunday mornings. Sandra sitting on the floor with him as he practiced lines for a small indie script. Grocery store runs. Shared toothbrush cups. Music playing from her son's room while Keanu grilled vegetables on the patio. There was no script to follow, no roles to play. Just two people finally living the scene they never thought they'd reach. But life, even in its most beautiful chapters, comes with echoes. It happened in the middle of a rainy afternoon, the kind of soft, cold day where the sky feels close and the house feels too still. Sandra stood at the window, watching droplets trail down the glass while the kettle hissed in the background. Keanu had gone to the bookstore, a place he still visited like a cathedral, and the kids were away on a school retreat. She should have felt peaceful, but a heaviness had returned. Not because anything was wrong, but because everything was finally right, and that's when the fear creeps in. Because once you have something, precious, really have it, the thought of losing it becomes unbearable. When Keanu returned and saw the look in her eyes, he didn't ask. He just walked up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. They stood there for several minutes, just breathing. When she finally spoke, it wasn't loud. "Do you think we were meant to wait this long?" He thought for a moment before answering, his voice quiet. "I think we had to grow into the kind of people who could hold this. Maybe we weren't ready before, not because we didn't love each other, but because we didn't know how to protect it." She nodded, a tear rolling down her cheek. "I used to be so scared of falling in love with you." "And now?" he asked. She turned to face him, her hands pressed against his chest. "Now I'm scared of anything but that." He smiled. Not the movie star smile, not the polite press smile, but the real one, the one he reserved only for her. And then he said the only thing that truly mattered. "Then let's not waste a single second more." It was around that time that they received an invitation, not from a producer or network, but from a small progressive film academy that Sandra had helped fund quietly over the years. They were hosting a storytelling symposium for young artists. Children from broken homes, underfunded schools, forgotten zip codes, kids who had learned to survive before they learned to dream. The organizers asked Sandra if she would give the keynote. She agreed on one condition, that Keanu join her. The night of the event was modest. No red carpet, no fanfare, just a small theater filled with trembling hands and hungry eyes, kids who looked at Sandra and Keanu not as celebrities but as proof that life could still open up in the most unexpected ways. They didn't talk about fame, they talked about silence. Sandra stood on that stage and spoke, not about her films, but about the moments she didn't speak, the fears she never voiced, the times she chose strength over vulnerability, and how that strength sometimes had been a shield against the very love she needed most. "I waited too long," she said honestly, her voice breaking. because I thought love had an expiration date. But the truth is, it doesn't. It waits for you. Sometimes in letters you didn't know existed. Sometimes in a friend who never left. And when it finally arrives, you don't have to perform. You just have to let it in. The room fell silent. Not because they were starstruck, but because they understood every word, every pause. Keanu followed her, and in his usual quiet way, said something that none of them would forget. Sometimes the person you've been searching for your whole life is standing beside you the entire time. And sometimes the bravest thing you'll ever do is turn toward them and say, "I see you now." They left the stage hand in hand. No kisses, no speeches, just peace. And in that peace a kind of legacy had been born. Not one made of awards or box office records, but of truth, of what it means to show up late, but with your whole heart. A few months later, they traveled, not to Europe or a film festival, but to a small town in the Pacific Northwest. Quiet, green, slow. They bought a home with uneven floors and creaky doors, the kind that wrapped around you like a warm blanket. They planted a garden. She painted again. He wrote letters. Not the kind he hid, but the kind he read aloud at night by the fire. They never had a wedding. They didn't need one. Because love, real love, doesn't always need an audience. It just needs two people who are finally ready. And so, after all the lights, after all the premieres, after decades of waiting and wondering and almost, Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves lived a love story the world would never fully see. But they did, and that was enough.